Well, in our continued study of the book of Acts, we're going to finish up chapter 21 today, and we're going to see the freedom of Paul as we know it and as we've seen it throughout much of the book of Acts come to an end. I think you've heard me say before that from this time forward, as we venture to finish up the book of Acts, the rest of what we see of the Apostle Paul, we see of a man in captivity. So we're going to see how it all came down, his arrest in Jerusalem. We'll unpack it. We'll take it apart and see what happens. Hope you stay with us. My name is Steve Gill, and you're listening to Loving the Scriptures. Well, here is, what we're going to look at today is something that, if you've been with us for a while and if you've been consistently with us in our study of the book of Acts, you're going to see something that looks very familiar here. And by the way, just having said that, if you're just discovering Loving the Scriptures, welcome. I would encourage you to stay, even though you haven't been with us through much of the study of the book of Acts. If you want to listen to previous episodes, you're more than welcome to do so, but would encourage you to stay on and see what's going on with what we're currently studying here in the book of Acts. And just as we're going through this, just as we're getting ready to finish up chapter 21, the end is coming closer and closer in sight. The book of Acts is 28 chapters, and we still got about 7 more chapters to go. But just kind of thinking back to all the ground that we've covered up to this point, it's been a good journey. So, but like I said, we still got a handful of chapters left to go. Still a lot of things to unpack in the book of Acts. So I hope that you stay with us as we continue on in that study until we reach its final conclusion. But as I just said a few seconds ago, if you've been with us for a while and looking at the missionary journeys of Paul, as we've been studying them through the book of Acts, today you're going to see something very familiar, and that is the uproar of a very angry crowd or a very angry mob. And even if you haven't been with us in our study of the book of Acts here on Loving the Scriptures, so if you're familiar with the book itself, if you've read it through Acts several times, or if you're fairly familiar with it, you know that what we see here in chapter 21 of Paul being grabbed and seized by a mob of angry people is not something that's new to the Apostle Paul. We've seen it on a few different occasions before. You might think of places like in chapter 14, for example, where the Jews take advantage of a crowd a crowd of Gentiles, actually, who whip them up to go against the Apostle Paul. And the Apostle Paul ends up actually getting stoned. And his disciples thought that he was dead when actually that wasn't the case, and he was alive. So miraculously, he survived such a harrowing experience. If you go a couple of chapters later over into chapter 16, if you remember, in the city of Philippi in the province of Macedonia, you have the Apostle Paul who drove a demon out of a slave girl, and the owners who got their fortune from this girl because she apparently told the future through these spirits were pretty upset. So they take them before the magistrates, and then before you know it, not just them, but the whole crowd who is there are yelling out against Paul and Silas. And so they end up getting beaten and then being thrown in prison. Now, of course, if you know the rest of the story, you know that there's something truly magnificent that happens with the conversion of a Philippian jailer and that sort of thing. So you have that went on there. You go the next chapter, in chapter 17, you see the whole thing of a mob being whipped up. And before anything fatal could happen, the Christians there send Paul away to safety. And then who can forget, in chapter 19, in the city of Ephesus, the crowd, the riot that started up, pretty much Demetrius was the instigator in that whole affair, which which really amounted to a lot of people gathering in the theater, and they were all shouting, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians." And Paul, bravely, I guess you would say, was going to venture out into the crowd to speak to the crowd, and some of his friends, and even some people who were not Christians but were friendly with Paul, the Asiarchs, said, "No, Paul, that's not a good idea." So, just in those examples, what you see is you see something where Paul is able to get people all riled up because of what he's saying. Now, of course, this isn't due to anything that the Apostle Paul is doing wrong. The Apostle Paul is doing everything right. People are very resistant to the truth, the truthful message that Paul has to speak. And so, with all of these things, with having to do with the crowds and the mob and everything like that, Paul is very familiar with that. And so once again, in our passage here that we're going to look at, to finish up chapter 21 of the book of Acts, we're going to see another crowd that gets whipped up against him, and who are, just as the text will say, are pretty intent on doing him harm. They were probably going to try and beat him to death. Just to provide a little bit of background, just from recently what we've seen over the last couple of times that we've been in the book of Acts, will be helpful. So again, we'll just remind ourselves of what's going on with all of this. Paul has arrived in Jerusalem. He's come from out west, and he sailed the Mediterranean to get to Jerusalem. And he was pretty intent on getting to Jerusalem because he had some financial gifts from the other churches, Gentile churches over in Macedonia and other places, Achaia and stuff, to bring to the impoverished church that was in Jerusalem. And so on his way there, and we see this in the beginning parts of chapter 21. What we see is Paul getting warnings that, just people encouraging him not to go to Jerusalem, because I think the indication was at that point, unlike before where it was kind of vague, there's a definite knowledge now that the hardships that the Holy Spirit had been warning Paul about that he would suffer is actually going to go down in Jerusalem. So with the Christians in Caesarea specifically, after the prophet Agabus had warned of this and said this is what's going to happen, you had the Christians who said that who begged Paul, were begging Paul not to go to Jerusalem, to which Paul responded and said that I'm not only willing to go to prison, but I'm willing to die for the name of the Lord Jesus. And so he wasn't going to be persuaded, and so they said, let the will of the Lord be done. So he finally makes it to Jerusalem. He has a meeting with James and some of the other elders of the church in Jerusalem. And what we talked about last time, this is where we were at last time, where apparently what we learned from that passage was that there had been word that had been going around and had been spreading about the Apostle Paul to Jews who were already Christians. Okay, so the words that were being received here were being received by Jewish Christians. And the word that was being spread around and being told to these Jewish Christians was that Paul, just the short of it, I don't want to re-dissect everything of what we looked at, but the short of it is that the messages they were receiving was that Paul was a guy who was going out among the Gentiles and was pretty much telling the Jews who were living among the Gentiles to get rid of their Jewish heritage. And he spoke against Moses and the custom of Moses. He told people not to have their children circumcised and that sort of thing. And so the idea that the elders had come up with was saying, to show these people that you don't have any problem with the law, here are 4 men who are under a vow. Cleanse yourselves alongside of them, pay their expenses and everything. Just go through the motions with these people so that they would know, and that they would understand that you are not against the Jewish law. And so, the question marks that might raise in people's minds as far as did Paul compromise on the gospel? The short answer to that question that I would give again is this time is no. If you want a fuller details as to why I say that, you just go back to the previous episode and listen to that, just to get caught up on that part of the discussion. But the thing that we need to remember here for our purposes today is that there had been some things circulating already, so we kind of get an understanding of what Paul is going to be dealing with here as he's in Jerusalem. Remember, he now knows that in Jerusalem is where everything is going to be going down, where he's going to be imprisoned, and so you see just kind of some things that have been kind of stirring about already, even before Paul got there. Okay. And so there were false, and by the way, everything that were all the things that were being told to these Jewish believers were not true; they were lies. So Paul was, for the sake of the Christians within the community, within the church at Jerusalem, he did what he did, which he wasn't. This was nothing foreign to him as far as fulfilling vows and things like that. Go back to Acts chapter 18. You see Paul doing the same thing for himself. But for the sake of these Christians, these Jews who are Christians within the Jerusalem church, he goes through this process with these four Christians. To, I would say, in large part, to prevent any sort of significant split within the Jerusalem church, because most of the Christians in Jerusalem had no problem with Paul. But with everything that had been spreading and circulating, there was a potential, you could probably say, of there being a division where there are some Jews saying Paul is not a great guy. He's telling us to give up our Jewish heritage, and then you have these other Christians just saying no, Paul is okay, and so that would really put a wrench in the work that God is doing within the city of Jerusalem. So all of that was for the sake of the believers inside the Jerusalem church. Now, as you're going to see, that doesn't necessarily quell the controversy that's circulating on those on the outside. In other words, those Jews who are not believers. So it may have worked. Who knows? I mean, the text doesn't really say, what the thoughts and attitudes were of the Jewish Christians after Paul helped these people out in fulfilling their vow. But what we're going to see, what we are going to witness here, are the angry words of Jews who are not believers. So even if he was able to satisfy sufficiently and debunk sufficiently in the eyes of these Jewish Christians, debunk these things, these lies that are being told about him, that doesn't do anything about what people thought of him on the outside, Jewish non-Christians, because they're the ones who are going to whip up this frenzy that we're going to read about here in the last verses of Acts chapter 21. And when all of this is going down, Paul gets arrested, and then, as I said, this is the last time we're going to see the free Paul, quote unquote free Paul. This is, so from this point on, throughout the rest of the book of Acts, we're going to see Paul in captivity. But still, even so, we're going to see the Holy Spirit working powerfully in Paul, even within his captivity. So we're going to, and of course, obviously, we're going to unpack that and unfold all that as we continue to go on in our study of the book of Acts. For now, let me go ahead and read the passage. I'll read it in its entirety, and I'll read up to, I'll read to the end of the chapter here. And so I'm in Acts chapter 21, and I'm starting in verse 27. And this is what it says. It says, "When the 7 days were almost completed, the Jews from Asia, seeing him in the temple, stirred up the whole crowd and laid hands on him, crying out, 'Men of Israel, help! This is the man who is teaching everyone everywhere against the people and the law and this place. Moreover, he even brought Greeks into the temple and has defiled this holy place.' For they had previously seen Trophimus the Ephesian with him in the city, and they supposed that Paul had brought him into the temple. Then all the city was stirred up, and the people ran together. They seized Paul and dragged him out of the temple, and at once the gates were shut. And as they were seeking to kill him, word came to the tribune of the cohort that all Jerusalem was in confusion. He at once took soldiers and centurions and ran down to them. And when they saw the tribune and the soldiers, they stopped beating Paul. Then the tribune came up and arrested him and ordered him to be bound with 2 chains. He inquired who he was and what he had done. Some in the crowd were shouting one thing, some another, and as he could not learn the facts because of the uproar, he ordered him to be brought into the barracks. And when he came to the steps, he was actually carried by the soldiers because of the violence in the crowd, for the mob of the people followed, crying out, "Away with him!" As Paul was about to be brought into the barracks, he said to the tribune, "May I say something to you?" And he said, Do you know Greek? Are you not the Egyptian then who recently stirred up a revolt and led the 4,000 men of the assassins out into the wilderness? Paul replied, "I am a Jew from Tarsus in Cilicia, a citizen of no obscure city. I beg you, permit me to speak to the people." And when he had given him permission, Paul, standing on the steps, motioned with his hands to the people. And when there was a great hush, he addressed them in the Hebrew language, saying, "Brothers and fathers, hear the defense that I now make before you." And that last part is the first verse of verse 22. Sometimes I don't understand these chapter divisions. That's a weird place, I think, to put chapter 22. But so there it is. I just read through all of the rest of chapter 21 and the first verse of 22. Now, chapter 22 is pretty much most of it. Most of it is Paul going over his testimony. It's a testimony that is fine for the Jews up to a point, and then Paul says something that really sets them off. So it's a testimony that brings about a lot of offense. What is it that brought that offense? Well, that's what we're going to talk about when we get back into the book of Acts next time, after we go through this here in chapter 21. But there you have the situation. There you see how everything went down, how the arrest goes down, and everything. And so once again, we see Paul embroiled in a situation where he's surrounded by a crowd of people who want to do away with him. And of course, this isn't anything new either. But just to go back, as we just go back to the beginning of the passage, and we start to unpack this here, you'll notice you go back to verse 27, and it says, when the 7 days were almost completed, the Jews from Asia, seeing him in the temple, stirred up the whole crowd and laid hands on him. Now, I think I had mentioned this last time. It's I think what we make of the 7 days in verse 27 says, when the 7 days were almost completed. I think that's referring to the time of the Nazirite vow that was left for these people that Paul was helping out. Those 4 Jews that were under that vow. And so at the end of the 7 days, they would bring this vow to completion with the necessary sacrifices and everything like that, plus shaving off their heads and everything like that. That's the impression that you get. There wasn't any sort of indication as far as specific number of days in the previous passage that we looked at last time. But now that we see here in verse 27, I think the indication that you get, the idea that you get, is that there were 7 days that were left for these people, these 4 Jews who were believers again, who were under this vow. And again, like I said last time, most likely what you're dealing with was the Nazirite vow that Jews voluntarily took. Okay, so it says all this that was going down was when this was almost completed. So I guess technically you could say that Paul was still in the middle of being in the process of executing these things as a demonstration to other Jewish believers that the things that have been said about him were not true. Okay, and so when the 7 days were almost completed, the Jews from Asia. Okay, so these are obviously. These are Jews that are not that don't reside in Jerusalem or even in the land of Israel, as it says there. Jews from Asia. They were from the province of Asia. Now, of course, by now we should be familiar with Asia in the sense that we've seen Paul do ministry in the province of Asia. particularly and specifically in the city of Ephesus. Okay. Now, what are these Jews from Asia doing in Jerusalem at the temple? Probably most likely, this is them along with Jews from all other areas of the Roman world who are there to celebrate Pentecost. Because remember, if you remember a while back when Paul is still trying to make his way to Jerusalem, the scripture says that his goal was to make it there was to make it to Jerusalem by Pentecost. So people there are celebrating the festival of Pentecost most likely. Now again, just so we don't get confused, and I know that I mentioned this long ago when we were in Acts chapter 2, so pretty much very near the time when we were getting off the ground in the study in the book of Acts. One thing we have to remember is that Pentecost was an actual festival, because we think Pentecost, from the Christian point of view, we think, oh, when the Holy Spirit came down, when the birth of the church, that sort of thing. But Pentecost was actually a festival. So when I say that people were there for Pentecost, in case you're confused by that, you say, well, wait a minute, what are you talking about? Pentecost was an actual thing. It was another name for it, that you might be familiar with from the Old Testament. It's the Feast of Weeks. Okay, so that's what that was. So it was an annual festival. So Jews, not just within the borders of Israel, but for Jews from other places outside of Israel, came to celebrate that. And that's what you saw in the passage about Pentecost. Because remember, when Peter and the apostles and everybody, they were speaking in tongues, you had these other people who were in there who were recognizing their languages, the primary languages that they would have been familiar with in the places that they had come from to celebrate Pentecost. So that's why these Jews from Asia are most likely in Jerusalem. That's probably most likely what they're doing there. They're there in Jerusalem because it's Pentecost, and they're there to celebrate. They're there to celebrate that time. So these are the people here that stir things up. So these Jews from Asia, as verse 27 continues to say, seeing him in the temple. Now keep that in mind there, of the whole thing of them seeing him in the temple, because there's an important observation to be made here. But they see Paul in the temple. And so what happens next, still in the middle of verse 27, stirred up the whole crowd and laid hands on him. And then going into verse 28, crying out, men of Israel, help. I always think of, when I come to this, it reminds me of, and I don't know if I should think of this or not. I mean, it's just something that always comes to my mind. But they lay their hands on Paul, and they're crying out for people to help them in this situation now that they see Paul. It reminds me of this one video. It's kind of old. It's a few years old now, where there is this professor. I don't even remember her name. I don't remember what the university she was on. But she was a part of some demonstration outside on campus, and he had a student there who was filming the whole thing, and the professor saying, you need to get out of here, and he's like, no, I have every right to be here. And so she turns around and tells these other people, she says, hey, can we get some more muscle over here? And as if we need some muscle to kind of get this guy and force him away from where we are. That's kind of what I think of, since that has happened. Whenever I come upon this passage, I kind of think about that. It's probably not a best one-for-one sort of illustration. I'm just telling you what comes to my mind whenever I read this now in chapter 21. But whatever the case may be for what was going on in the temple here, they already laid their hands on Paul. So they're already getting this whole thing, the whole physical abuse thing started. And so they're calling everybody else to come and help them and join them in exacting what they see as appropriate justice against this man who they think is in the wrong in pretty significant ways. So if you're looking there in verse 28, it says men of Israel, help. This is the man who is teaching everyone everywhere against the people and the law and this place. Now, man, you notice just kind of the emphasis of what's being said here, and it says he's this is the man who is teaching everyone everywhere. So they know that Paul is a well-traveled guy, and he's saying they're teaching everyone And here's a bit of a difference between what you see here and what you see in the accusations that were circulating before. In the previous passage. In the previous passage, the concern of what was being circulated around was that Paul was telling Jews that were living among the Gentiles to pretty much give up their Jewishness. That was the idea here. And I think that idea, that concept that people embraced as far as what they believed of the Apostle Paul is still a concern, at least for the people on the outside looking in. But there's a little bit of an addition to the problem here, as far as how these particular Jews see the Apostle Paul. Because now he's saying he's teaching everyone everywhere. Now, the everyone everywhere, does the everyone mean just all Jews? Maybe by saying everyone, they're saying every one of the Jews, where he's going and where he's traveling and that sort of thing. But then again, maybe when they're saying everyone, they're actually meaning everyone, Jews and Gentiles. And so they're saying with all of these people, they're speaking against our people. So this is a huge problem. So he's teaching everyone, and he's teaching everyone everywhere. In other words, he's blanketing the whole Roman world pretty much with this idea of getting rid of the law of Moses and speaking against this people. Okay, so he's teaching everyone everywhere, and listen, the term here is very important here. Against the people, he's teaching everyone everywhere against the people. Now that seems to be a kind of more of a ramped up charge of what we see here as opposed to what we saw previously in the previous passage here. So again, it seems like what is being perceived in the eyes of these non-believing Jews seems to be, I mean, maybe I'm right, maybe I'm wrong about this, but it seems to be, at least to me, on a little bit more of a heightened scale. Because now they're saying he's teaching everyone everywhere, and what he's speaking of is he's speaking against the people themselves. What we looked at before, the problem is that he's speaking against the customs of Moses. It really wasn't something that was aimed against the particular people. So in other words, it seems like what these people are saying is that this person is a traitor to his own people because he's going around and teaching other people. He's teaching other people things that go against the people of Israel themselves. He's teaching against the people. Wow, that is a pretty that's no small charge that's being made here. Now, how would these people, these Jews from Asia, come to this conclusion? Okay, well, hold on here. Let's see if we can. Just point out a couple other things here. Let's finish what they say here about Paul here. So it says that he's teaching everyone everywhere against the people and the law. So he's teaching against the law. In other words, he's saying the law is no good, which again we know that is not a thing actually, because Paul has just been going through the motions as it relates to fulfilling a vow, and Paul participated in that. Both for the sake of the Jewish Christians, and he's also done this on his own. Again, go back to chapter 18, I believe the verse is verse 18. So Acts 18:18, where it talks about Paul fulfilling his own vow. Okay. Now, of course, we're familiar with the epistles of Paul. We might actually think, well, isn't Paul against the law? Because again, it says you're not under law but under grace. Paul is against the law as it relates to the law being a means of salvation and that sort of thing, or as the writer of Hebrews would say, using the law by going back to the types and shadows and disregarding the reality that is fulfilled in Christ. If we're dealing with something where, as Paul was doing with a vow or something like that, obviously that wasn't a big deal. But these people are saying, okay, he speaks against this people, so he has a problem with us as Jews, and he has a problem with the law, which the law, the celebrating the law was a big thing around Pentecost, because one other thing that, if I understand correctly, that went on that was celebrated during Pentecost was the giving of the law to Moses at Mount Sinai. So during this time of Pentecost, for these people to say that Paul teaches other people, everyone, everywhere, against the law itself, that's surely to stir up some people in a very significant way. So these people are saying, okay, he teaches against the people, he teaches against the law, and then thirdly, it says, and this place, meaning the temple. Now, I told you before, to keep in mind that these people, these Jews from Asia, when all this is going down, they see Paul in the temple, okay? They see him in the temple. Now, it's very interesting that they see him in the temple, and then they accuse him of being somebody who speaks against the temple. You would think that if Paul was actually going around teaching things against the temple, against the holy place or whatever, that Paul would keep his distance. If the temple is that bad, then he wouldn't be going around there, spending time there in the first place. But it's just interesting that as they're throwing this accusation out against Paul, saying that he speaks against the temple, they're seeing him right there in the temple. It's kind of odd, kind of strange that you have that going on, that it doesn't cross their minds that maybe they need to rethink what's going on here a little bit. So here you have so those are the three big things, not the only thing, but three big things that these people are saying against the Apostle Paul. Now the question is, how do these Jews from Asia, how are they able to say this with much certainty? Remember, these are Jews from Asia. Where has Paul been spending a lot of time? He spent a lot of time in Asia, particularly in the city of Ephesus. In fact, he spent 3 years in Ephesus. So are these people, these Jews from Asia that see Paul in the temple, do you think that they are very familiar with Paul back in the time when Paul was actually there in Asia? Yeah, sure. I have no doubt. They may have actually heard Paul speak. They might have actually, heard a lot about what he said. And depending on the hardness of their heart, it seems pretty evident that what they would do is they would take what he would say, and either blow it out of proportion, or they themselves misunderstood, or whatever. You kind of know how this looks like, especially when you watch the news and you keep up with politics, where one person says one thing and then somebody on the other side of the political aisle say that, okay, he's saying this. And when what they're accusing this one person of saying is not really what they're saying at all. Just to give you an example of what this might look like, and this goes back to 2012, in the presidential election back then. You remember, those of you who keep up with the news and politics and stuff, you remember when Mitt Romney was caught on tape during a speech at some dinner or something. I think he said something along the lines of there were 47% of the poor who, what did he say exactly? He made a statistical statement about the poor. 47%. I think he said that won't be looking for jobs or something along those lines. I actually should have got more concrete things of what he said. But whatever the case, what he was saying, he was making a statistical statement about the poor. And I remember one time I was out. I went to a coffee shop with my computer. I was going to be doing some work, getting some work done, and was looking around and caught eyes with this guy across the room there. And, just kind of friendly gesture, nod, hey, how you doing? Yeah, I'm doing good. How you doing? You just kind of struck up. It was just kind of weird because this usually doesn't happen. You just kind of struck up a short minute and a half conversation. And then it came up on politics or something, and he said, "Did you hear the whole thing about how Mitt Romney hates poor people?" I said, "What?" He said, "Yeah, Mitt Romney hates poor people." I said, I didn't hear anything about this. Where did you get this? Oh, that whole statement that he made about the 47%. And I said, well, he wasn't saying that he hates the poor. He was just making a statistical statement about something that was true about the poor. He wasn't saying anything where he's saying, I hate poor people. just based on what Mitt Romney actually said, and the conclusion of Mitt Romney hates poor people is a pretty wide jump, And so that's an example where somebody hears one thing, and it was obvious to me this person was not a Mitt Romney fan. So you can see how this can easily happen from somebody from the other side of the aisle, where somebody takes something that somebody says and then they put their own conclusion and their own spin on it, saying, oh, so-and-so hates poor people, and that sort of thing. And I wouldn't be surprised that what we're dealing with here with these Jews that were from Asia, we're maybe dealing with the same thing. Because again, what we're dealing with here is are falsities. That what these people are saying about Paul are not true. Okay, now whether they've heard one thing and then unconsciously twisted things for it to sound like something else, or whether they understood perfectly what Paul was saying and out of conviction, out of fighting the conviction in their heart or whatever, they're going against Paul and deliberately telling all of these falsehoods. Who knows? But in their minds, they're saying, in their whole thing of saying is that he's speaking against the Jewish people, he's speaking against the law, and he's speaking against the temple. He's speaking against this place. Okay, and I could see where somebody might sinfully sin. I'm not defending these people, but I can see how they would sinfully assume that, because if you remember Paul in Ephesus, specifically in chapter 19, remember that he had spent a lot of time with the Jews in the synagogue, teaching them, and there was a group of people who rose up and they were speaking against Paul, and they were speaking against the faith in front of the congregation. And so what Paul did is that he withdrew himself from the synagogue and he went next door to the hall of Tyrannus. And so that may have set them off in their own minds and saying, okay, he's going to start teaching against the Jewish people. As outlandish as something like that would be in reality, I can see how some people would start to circulate that around. So how do these Jews from Asia know all this? Well, they've probably been around at the same time that Paul was, specifically when he was in Ephesus, right? So that's how they know Paul, and that's how they start circulating these things all around about Paul and what he does, or allegedly what he does and what he teaches. Now in verse 28, still in verse 28, they're not done yet with Paul. They say, moreover, he even brought Greeks into the temple and has defiled this holy place. Now that's a big deal, because you didn't have Greeks or Greeks/Gentiles, whatever you want to call it. Greek is a Gentile, right? It was a pretty serious thing that Gentiles were not allowed past a certain point of the temple. There was a somewhat of a court for Gentiles, but beyond that, there was a wall with inscriptions, and you saw these inscriptions all on all sides of the temple in different places. That was a warning to the Gentiles there that if you go past this wall, if you go past this partition here into the areas that you are not allowed in, then it essentially, I'm not quoting this word for word, obviously, but pretty much it was a warning for their death. If you cross here, you're going to die. You will be killed. Because what they saw in all of this is that a Gentile in the temple of the Lord would be a defilement against the temple. Okay. And so what these people are saying is that Paul brought Greeks into the temple and had defiled the holy place. Now, what is their proof? What is their proof to back up their accusation? Nothing solid, I assure you. Okay, nothing solid, because here's the thing: as you go on and read in verse 29, it says, "For they had previously seen Trophimus the Ephesian with him in the city." Now, they may probably are familiar with Trophimus as well, because as it says here, Trophimus is from Ephesus. Trophimus the Ephesian, so they may recognize Trophimus as well, and so they see Trophimus in the city. They recognize him, and they recognize that he is associated with Paul, right? And so it says, "For they had previously seen Trophimus the Ephesian with him in the city, and they supposed that Paul had brought him into the temple." So they really didn't see Trophimus in the temple. They just supposed that Paul had brought him into the temple. They know that Trophimus is associated with Paul; those two are connected to the hip. And so if Trophimus is in Jerusalem, then, he's got to be with Paul in all sorts of times. And so probably, most likely, in their minds, they're thinking that they brought him in, that they brought Trophimus, that Paul brought Trophimus into the temple. So a wildly, wildly unfair accusation, which, that would have been, if that is something that Paul actually did, which it's not, but if that's something that Paul did, that's a very bad thing that he would have done for Trophimus for his sake, because that would have meant death for his friend if that was the case. But this is what they're circulating around now, not only of what Paul is taught as far as the people, the law, and the temple, but they're also talking about what Paul supposedly did. And again, we know that this is false as well, and saying he brought Greeks into. And notice there, he says they said that he even brought Greeks, plural, into the temple, not a Greek. Not that it makes much of a difference, but I mean, you see how embellished it is. And they say Greeks, plural, just by their sight of one Greek, singular, in the person of Trophimus. And so, for them, that's just sight of Trophimus, that's enough for them. And so they draw their own conclusions erroneously. And so when they see Paul at the temple, they attack him and lay their hands on him. Okay, now in verse 30, it says, "Then all the city was stirred up, and the people ran together." So again, like I said, this is nothing new. The city was stirred up, and does it really mean literally the whole city? I mean, probably not, but a good part of the city is probably there at the temple, because again, this is the time of festival there at Pentecost. So a large number of people congregating there at the temple, who are around at this whole thing. They're called and they say, hey, this is what's going on. So as verse 30 says, it says, then all the city was stirred up, and the people ran together. They seized Paul and dragged him out of the temple, and at once the gates were shut. So they shut the gates so that none of this can spill back in, because if it spills back in and they kill Paul in the temple, that would defile the temple, So, they're doing all these things falsely against Paul. But we still got to keep the law, and we got to still follow its stipulations. So don't do anything to defile the temple, please. You just kind of see the ridiculousness of things as it's being unfolded here. Verse 31, and as they were seeking to kill him, word came to the tribune of the cohort that all Jerusalem was in confusion. Now this tribune person, he's a commander. I believe he would be considered one who has command over 1,000 people, whereas a centurion would have command over 100 people. And as we see here just in a little bit, he's going to bring a couple of centurions. Now, I don't think that means that him plus a couple of centurions means that they brought all of their cohort, which would equal like over 200 and maybe even 1,000 or so, something like that. But I think he may have just grabbed a couple of centurions and maybe a handful of guards or something like that, or maybe a lot of guards, but enough to quell the situation that happens down there. Whatever the case may be, we see that the Roman authorities, the Roman soldiers are going to get involved here, and so they were, and as it says there at the beginning of verse 31, they were seeking to kill him, and so word came. This is still in verse 31 to the tribune of the cohort that all Jerusalem was in confusion. And this wasn't anything new to the Roman soldiers or Roman people in authority either. They knew that there were times when the Jews could be whipped up in a frenzy or in an outrage because of something or other. Remember, that's one of the reasons why Claudius had kicked out the Jews from Rome. You remember from what we saw back in. I believe it's chapter 18 of the book of Acts, and it was because of we saw that it was because of riotous activity and things like that. But let's see here. So in verse 32 says he at once took soldiers and centurions and ran down to them. And when they saw the tribune, the crowd saw the tribune, and the soldiers, they stopped beating Paul. So they were beating him this whole time. So they were probably looking to beat him to death. I guess it's interesting that they didn't think of stoning or anything like that. But apparently they had been beating him. Paul obviously outnumbered here, was clearly at a disadvantage, and they were beating him. But when they saw the Roman authorities, they stopped beating him. Verse 33, then the tribune came up and arrested him and ordered him to be bound with 2 chains. He inquired who he was and what he had done. So make the arrest now and ask questions later is pretty much the game that you have going on there. And I guess in a way, though, it is kind of for his safety that all of this was happening. To put him in chains in case he was guilty of something or whatever. But whatever the case, they bound him with 2 chains, and he, the tribune, inquired him who he was and what he had done. Now, this line of questioning, it looks like here, let's see, he inquired who he was and what he had done. So this is actually the tribune, the commander, this Roman commander, asking the crowd, because obviously something's got to be up for them to be beating Paul like this. And so he's asking them, what gives with this guy? Who is he and what's he done? And so this here, what we're going to see here in verse 34 is another familiar thing that we've seen. Some in the crowd were shouting one thing, some another. And as he could not learn the facts because of the uproar, he ordered him to be brought into the barracks. So all around, so in short, there's chaos. That's the short of it. There's chaos. Now, again, remember what we saw in the riot in Ephesus. It's just interesting. You saw this whole thing in Ephesus, and you see now here in Jerusalem this whole frenzy that started up from people in Asia, and again, probably most likely. Well, I shouldn't say most likely from Ephesus, but it's a good chance that they're from Ephesus who get this whole thing started as well. And so you see this whole thing of confusion. Which is somewhat similar to what we saw with the riot in Ephesus in chapter 19. And so you have some people yelling one thing and some people saying another thing. And so there wasn't any way that the commander could get down to the bottom of things with all the chaos that's going on, especially when he's getting conflicting words from everybody all around him. And so, since he couldn't learn the facts, what he did was that he ordered him to be brought into the barracks, somewhere that's quiet and trying to get away from the people. Now, as we see here, as they're trying to get to the barracks, the crowd follows. So they're trying to escape the crowd, and the crowd is following them, even as they're trying to get them to the barracks. Verse 35, and when he came to the steps, he was actually carried by the soldiers because of the violence of the crowd. For the mob for the mob of the people followed, crying out, "Away with him!" So they had to actually pick this guy up and carry him away instead of having him on foot, because it was safer being carried up in the air than to do otherwise. And so, as it says there in verse 36, it says for the mob of the people followed, crying out, "Away with him." So it's pretty clear what they want, what these people want to have done with Paul. They say this guy needs to die. That's the seriousness of speaking against the Jewish people, speaking against the law, speaking against the temple, and actually bringing, in their minds, again, this isn't true, but bringing Greeks into the temple to defile the place. And all of that in their mind is worthy of death. It's worthy of death. Okay, so so it says Paul is being carried by the soldiers. You can just imagine the scene here. I mean, this is a wild scene that's going on here. From a distance, I would have liked to have seen what this actually looked like in person. If there was a time machine and I could go back, of course, in the distance, because I don't want to get caught up in all the melee and brouhaha of the whole thing. But what would it look like? What did this whole thing look like? I mean, it had to have been a gnarly scene there. And it says because of the violence of the crowd. So they still had a violent spirit about them as this whole thing is going on. They had been beating him before, and the sense that you probably get is that they were trying to beat him to death And here in verse 30, verse 35, they're identified as a violent crowd. But in verse 37, it says, as Paul was about to be brought into the barracks, he said to the tribune, "May I say something to you?" And he said, Do you know Greek? Are you not the Egyptian then who recently stirred up the revolt and led the 4,000 men of the assassins out into the wilderness? So apparently, this commander was surprised that Paul knew Greek. Perhaps maybe they thought that Paul was maybe they were dealing with a less educated person because Greek was more of a sophisticated language, I guess, spoken among the more educated, I guess. And I say that because it's not necessarily all that unusual for Jews to know Greek. Greek was a common language, was a universal language, where commerce and stuff was done and things like that. So, but I think it must have been, they thought that he was, somebody who maybe they were dealing with somebody who was kind of more of the rabble, less educated sort of people who didn't know Greek. And so when Paul starts belting out Greek and talking to this guy, saying, "Hey, can I say something to you?" He says, "Oh, you know Greek?" And then he says, "Are you that Egyptian that led this revolt, who recently stirred up a revolt and led the 4,000 men of the assassins out into the wilderness?" Now, this whole thing with this Egyptian, I looked in a few resources. I couldn't find any name for this Egyptian, and that's not to say that there isn't anything recorded as far as who this specifically, as far as a proper name, who this Egyptian was. I just might not know. It just might be in other resources that I wasn't able to look at. But apparently, there had been an Egyptian who had declared that he was going to overthrow Roman rule. And so he and a group of people here, as it's laid out in the text, there's 4,000 men of the assassins who were along with him. The revolt wasn't successful. It was squashed down, and the Egyptian escaped. And so this tribune is thinking, okay, is this guy? Could this possibly be the Egyptian that led that revolt? The whole thing with the assassins, because it says there, who recently stirred up a revolt and led the 4,000 men of the assassins. The assassins were people who went around, and mostly this happened in crowded areas where people went with daggers and they stabbed and killed Jews and Romans, actually, and Jews who they thought were sympathetic to the Romans. They were, as the name would suggest, they were assassins. They kind of had the name of Sicarii, which is kind of has the meaning of dagger. They were dagger men. And so what they were known for, again, was going around in crowded areas, and if they're, their target would be, people who they suspected were sympathetic to Roman rule, and they would kill them. That's a dead ringer MO for the Zealots, actually. And so it wouldn't surprise me if this whole term of assassins here, 4,000 men of the assassins, is just another term for Zealots. And you may have heard of the Zealots before. That's what the Zealots did. One of the original 12 that followed Jesus had been a zealot, Simon the Zealot. You remember his name mentioned. Now, obviously, he wasn't a zealot anymore once he joined Christ. But just to give you an idea, so these were assassins, and in some cases political assassins, Roman who would assassinate Roman people, and also Jews that they figured were sympathetic to the Romans. And so that's who those people were. So this guy is asking, are you the Egyptian that led that revolt and led the 4,000 people of the assassins or the zealots out into the wilderness. And so Paul, in verse 39, it says, Paul replied, I am a Jew from Tarsus in Cilicia, a citizen of no obscure city. Cilicia Tarsus, which is in Cilicia, province in Cilicia, was a university town. So there was a lot of education and stuff that goes on there. When it makes this whole thing of a citizen of no obscure city, in large part, that's what he's referring to. It was a very important city, and it was a university city. And that may have been to highlight all the more one of the reasons why he was, he knew Greek, just the way that he did. But he says, no, that's not me. I'm a Jew. I'm from Tarsus in Cilicia, blah, blah, blah. And in verse 40, and at the end of verse 39, it says, I beg you, permit me to speak to the people. And this is just like Paul. Again, we saw the same thing in chapter 19 with the riotous crowd in Ephesus. And in that sense, it was totally unsafe for him to do so. In this situation here, he's going to be surrounded by guards, so maybe it's perhaps a little bit safer for him to do this. And he says, I beg you, I want to speak to the crowd. And so in verse 40, it says, and when he had given him permission, Paul, standing on the steps, motioned with his hands to the people. Perhaps just motioning them for them to quiet down, giving them an indication that he wanted to say something. And so it says there, following there, and when there was a great hush, he addressed them in the Hebrew language, or in other words, the Hebrew dialect. And so if you skip over to verse 2 of chapter 22, the following chapter, when you read there, it says, and when they heard that he was addressing them in the Hebrew language, they became even more quiet. Now, we'll talk about that a little bit when we get into this next time, when we pick up chapter 22. But here we're at a cliffhanger. Dun, dun, dun. So, it's, the crowd has been whipped up. And again, this isn't the conclusion of the story in itself. We're still working our way through this story here of Paul getting into captivity and things like that. We're just going through how we got there, and we've come up to this point now where Paul is about to give his testimony. Okay, so he's going to speak to the crowd about what God has done for him and in his life, and which would explain, what his theology is, what he's doing, and everything like that. Now, as we're going to see, the ending isn't a happy ending here. So, we'll go through all of that when we get to that later. But for now, we're going to leave it there. To be continued, ... right? So as we continue to unfold this and we just see what's going on with the Apostle Paul, we'll kind of get into some interesting things here. So we'll leave it there. If you like this show, and if you've come up on Loving the Scriptures for the first time, or if you've listened for a little bit and you haven't done so already, I would encourage you to subscribe to my show on iTunes and also on Google Play for free. Also, check out Loving the Scriptures on Twitter. The handle is @LTScripts. That's LTSCRIPTS, which stands for Loving the Scriptures. All right, what we're going to do is we're going to take another break from the book of Acts. We're going to take a couple of weeks, just as we're making our way into Easter, and making our way to Resurrection Sunday. And so next time, what I want to do is we're gonna examine the gospel in its fullness, just kind of an overview of the gospel, just to be reminded of what it means for Christ to have died for our sins. And I'm gonna draw from a sermon that I preached last year that was leading up to Good Friday. Just to kind of lay all of that out. And I would encourage you to tune in and stay tuned for that, because it's never a bad idea to be reminded of what Christ has done for us, right? What it means for Christ who have paid for our sins, and just the blessedness of that. So I want you to tune in for that, and just tune in to, if nothing else, to just be encouraged. That's really what I want. I want you to be encouraged, and I want you to be reminded of what the Lord has done for you. And we'll be examining different portions of Scripture to kind of bring a broad overview of the gospel kind of together, and just kind of that sort of thing. And then the following week after that, what I'll probably do is did this last year, post on Resurrection Sunday as we talk about the resurrection of Jesus Christ and just celebrate the reality of that. Okay, and then after that point, we will go ahead and continue in the book of Acts, picking up in chapter 22. Now, I've mentioned this before, and I still haven't decided yet, but I was playing with the idea of, not taking any more breaks once we get back into the book of Acts and just going from chapter 22 and taking however many episodes it takes until we get through the book of Acts, the rest of the book of Acts. Maybe that's what I'll do. If we don't do that, probably what I'll do is I'll probably just take one more break of maybe a 1 or 2 episode break, just kind of in the middle there. So maybe after, I don't know, maybe after chapter 25 or something, and then after that point on, just going on and finishing up the rest of the book of Acts. I don't know. Nothing's written in stone, but I've mentioned that before, and I'm still trying to work that out. So anyway, glad that you joined us for this episode. I hope that you got a lot out of it, just as far as understanding of what's going on with the Apostle Paul. And again, this is all one story, so we're kind of being left in the middle of things here, and things are left hanging. So hang with us here and continue to be with us when we continue in the book of Acts, and we'll see the story play itself out, and we'll see God's goodness even in the midst of all of this. Okay, so glad that you're able to join us. Hope to see you here next time. My name is Steve Gill. I hope you have a good, blessed week. Bye now.